So a couple of quick announcements before we get going. One is to say thank you to the James Irvine Foundation. This event today is part of a series we do throughout the year about a number of different policy topics and a lot of the research work that we do. And the series is funded by the James Irvine Foundation, so a thank you there, especially if you like the beer, bread, and the food. Also, one announcement about our next event. On Monday, we have a great event. I think it's going to be an interview with the two new leaders of the state legislature. Senator Kevin De Leon, who will take over as Senate President Pro Tem after the election, and Assemblywoman Toni Atkins, who is the new Speaker of the State Assembly. So they will be in a conversation with PPIC President Mark Baldessari at the Sheraton on Monday at lunchtime. That's the good news. The bad news is it's already sold out. It's we well over 400 people, and we're at capacity. So it will be streamed live. You can still watch it online if you want. Which reminds me that also this event today is being taped for broadcast. So if you want to avoid an embarrassing moment, this is a good time to turn off your phone. There on your chair, just a reminder, there's an evaluation form that if you wanted to fill it out at the end of the event and tell us how you think we did and leave it on the table on your way out, that would be much appreciated. There's also a copy of today's report, which is also on our website, ppic.org, along with the slides that you'll see today and all the other work from our presenters that you'll hear from today. So with that, let me introduce Sarah Bohn. Sarah is a research fellow at PPIC and has been here for a number of years and done a lot of work on poverty issues, and she'll give our presentation today. So please welcome Sarah Bohn.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. First, I wanted to acknowledge my co-author and colleague, Caroline Danielson, who's here, and she'll be fielding all the difficult questions at the end of my presentation. So we've undertaken to better understand child poverty in more detail across the state, with an eye towards the role of the social safety net in mitigating need among California's children. Yes, no, maybe? All right. The stakes for policy to reduce child poverty in California are especially high, and that's because the wealth of research that associates poverty in early life with adverse outcomes in a number of areas really down the road, even for a long period to come. So children who experience poverty early in life may be at risk of slower brain development, of adverse health outcomes. They're more likely to have diminished success in school at various levels, from elementary school to the likelihood of completing high school even. Also, children who experience poverty are less likely to work as adults and more likely to experience poverty themselves well into adulthood. So I think the stakes are especially high for policy to address poverty, especially at early ages, and that's why we've chosen to look at this issue. About what we find is about 1/4 of California's children are in need. That's our estimate as of 2011, and it's higher than the rates that you would see among working age adults or among older adults as well. Safety net programs are really the key policy tool that we use to try to mitigate this kind of poverty in California. And so how much these programs already do impact poverty and how much they could further reduce poverty are really key questions that need answers. However, policymakers don't have a wealth of metrics that are really useful for answering those questions at their hands. The official poverty statistics that we all look at and use to measure kind of how we're doing are actually pretty old. They're based on a 1960s formula that has really not changed since then at all. In particular, it doesn't take account of safety net programs that have changed a lot since the 1960s and are directly intended, at least in part, to address poverty. So for that reason, we've developed a new metric called the California Poverty Measure that's more comprehensive than official statistics and more up-to-date as well. This is work that we've undertaken with co-authors at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. And about exactly 1 year ago, we released the first year of data from that research. What I'll be talking about today and what the report you have on your seats pertains to is really that same source of data, but we've taken a deeper look at the circumstances among children in our state. So how this new, and I argue better measure works, is by taking a more comprehensive view of what families actually have on hand to meet basic needs. And this is how it works, kind of in a simple framework. What we do is we count resources that families have, particularly from earnings through work, as well as from safety net benefits that they receive. Now, these could be cash benefits, like CalWORKs, or the Earned Income Tax Credit that they receive. It could also be in-kind benefits, and we count those as well. We monetize and count, for example, food stamps from the CalFresh program, or the value of housing subsidies and the like. We also include other sources of income, like unemployment insurance or child support. This gives us a more complete picture of the resources families have on hand to meet their basic needs, more complete than the official poverty statistics that are often used. What we do next is also take account of non-discretionary expenses that families face. These are out-of-pocket costs that they spend on medical care, on commuting, and on childcare. And these are only out-of-pocket expenses, and we deduct those from their resources so that we have a more accurate sense of the net resources they have on hand to meet basic needs. And then what we do is compare that estimate of net resources to an estimate of what it takes to make ends meet at a basic level. That's what we call our poverty threshold, our California Poverty Measure threshold. And this is similar in some ways to the federal poverty line that I'm sure you're familiar with a few changes that make it, we think, more up to date. First, it takes account of what families actually spend on basic things that they need to make ends meet, including food, clothing, shelter, and utilities in those basic areas. We use kind of an estimate of what families in the U.S. actually spend on those. And then it varies by family size, it varies by where you live, and that way it takes account of differences in cost of living, particularly from housing costs. And that's the key advantage really over the federal poverty line, which doesn't vary no matter where you live. On average in California in 2011, our threshold was about $30,000 for a family of 4. So you can see that that's not a very generous level of needs. It's still minimal in the way that the federal poverty line is, but has advantages in being more accurate at what families are actually facing depending on where they live. So if a family's net resources are above that threshold, then they're considered not in poverty by our measure, just like any other basic poverty statistics. If their resources fall below that threshold, then they're counted as in poverty. And for children, what we assume is that families share resources within the family. So a child is only in poverty if the family that they're a part of is also counted in poverty. Those of you familiar with the supplemental poverty measure from the Census Bureau will note the similarities. Indeed, our research is based on the same methodology, but is much more detailed for California, and it takes account of some California policy intricacies. In the remainder of the talk, I'll present to you our major findings about child poverty in California, then discuss regional variation in those statistics, and finally discuss factors that we find based on our research that drive or mitigate child poverty in the state. So first, our overall findings. And they're quite sobering. About 2.3 million children in the state are poor as of 2011. That's 25%, 1/4, of the population of people age 17 and under. This estimate is just slightly higher than official poverty statistics would lead you to believe. And based on those official statistics, it seems that poverty is possibly declining in California in the last year or so, slightly, but it's still quite high. What we did next was look at how these rates of poverty vary according to how old children are, and thinking that policies target different age groups of children. For example, school meals program benefits particularly children who are in school. That would be age 6 to 12 or 13 to 17 in the way that we've broken it up. but also a lot of efforts are focused on that 0 to 5 age range, noting that early interventions in poverty are likely to pay off in the long run. We were somewhat surprised to find that the rate of poverty across these age groups really does not vary very much in California. So between about 24 or 26% of children of any of these 3 age ranges is roughly the same. Because a kind of dichotomous poverty variable or statistic that just tells you whether families are in or out of poverty really doesn't fully encapsulate the spectrum of need, we next looked to a bit more broadly at how families are faring. One measure that we used is referred to often as the deep poverty rate, and that's families who fail to have less than 50% of the poverty threshold, so less than 50% of what they need to make ends meet. And that's the greenish slice at the top of this pie. It's about 6%, or about 500,000 children in the state are in families in that severe level of need. It's hard to characterize it as a bright spot in some ways, but that's actually a bit lower than official poverty statistics on deep poverty would have you believe. So the next slice of the pie, the orange piece, is those children who are in families who are not in deep poverty, but they're still in poverty. So they're between 50 and 100% of the threshold. That's 19%. So you can see how those first 2 pieces kind of add up to our overall poverty rate of about 25% in the state. The next group that we look at are families who are considered near poor. This is also a common measure where we look at families that are above the poverty line, but they have less than 150% of it. So they're not considered poor based on a simple statistic, but they're certainly at risk, or they're close to being in need. And that's actually a slightly larger share of California's children. About 26%, or about 2.4 million children, are in families that are considered near poor, that are just above the poverty line. So altogether, about 50% of California's children are in families who are either poor or close to poverty. So next, I'll present our findings on regional variation, how children are faring in different parts of the state. And this map, I hope you can see, shows the regions that we've constructed, and what we find generally is that more children are poor in coastal and southern areas of the state than in other regions. And I wanted to make a note that these are kind of the regions necessitated by the data, as we don't have a huge sample with which to get much more detailed geographical information. We would love to have that, and maybe in the future that's possible. But this is kind of what we're limited to now in terms of detail at the regional level. So we've constructed regions to be hopefully representative of different parts of the state that you're familiar with. So we find the highest rates of child poverty in Los Angeles County, and in Orange County, it's about 30 to 31% of children there are in need. The kind of second highest counties or regions are the Central Coast region, which goes from Monterey to Ventura, and San Diego County. Both of those are in the kind of 26 to 27% of children there in need. A bit of a surprising finding is that the Inland Empire has a similar child poverty rate to the Bay Area, which is often thought of as, of course, much more affluent than the southern inland parts of California. Their poverty rates are about 22 to 23%. And I'll note that the Inland Empire is really what we often think of as the Inland Empire plus Imperial County. The Sacramento region, which stretches from Yolo County all the way to the eastern border of the state, is in the kind of same range. About 22% of children in this region are in families with not enough resources to meet basic needs. The lowest child poverty rates that we observe are in the northern counties, about 17% of children there, and about 18% of children in Central Sierra, which is the Central Valley plus the bordering Sierra counties to the east. And I'll discuss in much more detail some of the factors that drive this variation across the state and produce some of the surprising results. Just as a bit of foreshadowing, housing costs really is looming large here, but the role of the safety net is also playing a major role and a differing role across the state. What we did next was look more closely at children of different ages across the state, again with the interest of shining light on how young children versus elementary school children and teenagers are faring. And what we find is slightly different than in the state overall picture. Younger children in almost all the regions are more likely to be in poverty than children of older ages. So it ranges from about 20% of young children, that's age 0 to 5 in the northern region, to a high of about 32% in Orange County. One major exception to that is Los Angeles County, the most populous county as well, where regardless of the age of the child, the poverty rates are pretty much the same. They're about between 30 and 31%. So next, let's explore some of the factors that drive child poverty or mitigate child poverty. The three that we're able to kind of try to disentangle a bit more based on our research using the California Poverty Measure are the cost of living, the role of family earnings and work, and then lastly, the role of the safety net. So I'll take those three in turn. As I mentioned, the overall state average kind of poverty threshold, the amount of money that families need to make ends meet, according to our measure, is about $30,000. This chart shows how where you live really changes that picture a lot. So in regions where you see the bar going to the left, these are places where you need substantially actually less resources to be counted up, to make ends meet. And areas with bars leaning towards the right are places where you need more to make ends meet. And I'm sure you're not surprised when you look at some of the places you're familiar with. So we see in Central Sierra region, that's Central Valley and Sierra counties, as well as the northern counties of the state, families need substantially less resources to make ends meet, on the order of $4,000 to $5,000 less. So we're talking about $24,000, $25,000 just to make ends meet in those counties. Now if at the other extreme, in Orange County or in the Bay Area, it's about $10,000 more. So if the same family but living in a different area like the Bay Area or Orange County needs about $10,000 more just to make ends meet. And this variation tends to drive down poverty in low-cost areas or drive up poverty in other areas. So how can families possibly make up the difference? One issue that we raise in our report is that safety net benefits don't account for this variation in cost of living. So it's really not increased safety net benefits that can help families make up this difference in what they need to make ends meet. It really needs to come from earnings. And so next we looked at how poor families are faring in terms of their work and earnings level. And what we find is that by far the majority of children who are poor in California are in families with at least one working adult. So about 79% of children in poor families are in working poor families, in fact, in this state. Although this does vary by region. So it's from a low of about 60% of poor children in northern counties are in a working family, and about 87% of families at the high end in Orange County are in a working family. So you can see how the kind of cost of living in a place is correlated to some extent with the likelihood the family is making earnings from work. In the Bay Area, the Central Coast, and Orange County, those, if you remember from the previous chart, were the highest cost places to live. A higher share of poor children are in working families there. We next looked a little bit more closely at how much poor families are earning, and the differences are even kind of starker there. So about 50% less than 50% of poor children in northern counties, in Central Sierra region, and in Sacramento are in families who make substantial earnings. In fact, they don't even make enough earnings kind of equivalent with what you would make from a minimum wage job. That is kind of just roughly about $12,000 if you think of an $8 an hour job and working about 30 hours a week. That would be roughly $12,000. So less than half of poor children in some areas of the state are in families making even that low level of earnings. But you can see in some of the higher cost regions like the Bay Area and Orange County, many more poor children are in families making at least that, if not more. So this suggests that some combination of factors like the availability of good paying jobs, families' preparation to be able to take those jobs, and also the need to earn more money to make ends meet in certain areas is a contributing factor to the variation in poverty rates across the state. The next factor that we look at that contributes or mitigates child poverty is the social safety net, and indeed that's the focus of our work. This table lists major safety net programs that are counted in our measure, and they include CalWORKS, General Assistance, Supplemental Security Income, CalFresh, the state's food stamps program, the Child Tax Credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit, federal housing subsidies, and the school meals program. You can see that these major programs benefit millions of Californians, and billions of dollars are spent on them at various levels of government, from federal, state, and local budgets. Now, these programs are not all directly aimed at reducing poverty, of course. They have multiple and diverse aims. For example, CalWORK supports work, CalFresh supports nutrition and health, as does the school meals program, in addition to supporting educational outcomes and attainment. But because these set of programs do add to family resources in some tangible way, they have the potential in our measure to also mitigate poverty to some extent. And one nice feature of the California Poverty Measure is that we take these into account holistically and together. So we've counted family participation and receipt of these sorts of benefits all in tandem. And often research kind of takes programs one at a time and looks at their effect. But in reality, families often choose different resources and pool resources from multiple programs. So we're able to take account of these major safety net programs in kind of a holistic manner. What we find is that without these major safety net benefits in California, an additional 1.3 million children would be considered poor in our state. We again looked at how that varies across age ranges for children, and again, we don't find stark differences there. So without safety net benefits, an additional 420,000 children age 5 and under would be considered poor, and roughly the same number of children in elementary age or teenagers would also be considered poor without the safety net benefits that their families receive. In total, nearly 40% of California's children would be considered poor if we did not count their family receipt of major safety net benefits. We then look at how that varies across the state to see if this is how it mitigates poverty in different parts of California, and if it's kind of comparable or if it's different. And indeed, we find there are some stark differences in how much safety net mitigates child poverty in different parts of the state. I'll start with Los Angeles, which is towards the bottom of this chart, which, as you may remember, had the highest rate of child poverty of any region that we looked at in California. Without the safety net, Los Angeles County would still have the highest poverty rate, and it would be nearly 46% of children in the county would be considered poor without the safety net benefits that their families receive. A really stark and alarming rate, I think. But the Central Sierra region, is now kind of close to that, is actually the second highest rate of child poverty were it not for safety net benefits. In fact, the poverty rate there would jump, it would actually double. It would go from about 22 to 23% of children. 22, sorry, to 43% of children in Central Sierra would be considered poor without safety net benefits that we count in our measure. So that's actually kind of a stronger effect on a percentage basis than in Los Angeles County. And in a few other counties, we see a similar kind of doubling of the poverty rate among children were it not for the safety net. And that includes in the northern region, in Sacramento area, as well almost in the Inland Empire, where the rate of child poverty would almost double. At the other extreme, when we look at counties that were among those that are higher cost, like the Bay Area and Orange County that had the highest poverty thresholds, the highest kind of baseline needs that families need to make ends meet. The kind of poverty mitigating effect of the safety net programs there is among the smallest in this state. So about 8% more children in the Bay Area would be considered poor without the safety net, and 7% more in Orange County. So I think this chart and thinking about the factors that we've discussed point to the complexity of the issues around the safety net and family circumstances in California. The variation that we see in housing costs and the threshold of needs that families must earn in order to make ends meet means that some families need substantially more. And indeed, we see that poor families in high-cost areas do actually earn more. But because their safety net benefits are not tied to the cost of living, that contributes to the difference in the impact of the safety net in these places. Of course, this leaves out other considerations of safety net programs like eligibility. Families, there's variation in what families are eligible, how accessible the safety net is in some places, more accessible in some than others, or the willingness of a population in a given region to actually enroll when they are eligible. To sum up, what we find is about 2.3 million of California's children are considered poor under the California poverty measure. That's a bit higher than official estimates suggest. And what we see is that these rates do vary substantially by region, but I would characterize them as still high, even in the kind of lowest poverty rate areas of our state. What our diverse regions have in common is that the safety net does play a major role in all regions of the state in mitigating child poverty, even though there is some variation left there to explain. So we've seen that safety net policy does indeed help mitigate child poverty in the state. The question that we kind of leave you with is can it do more? Of course, policies are routinely debated to make changes to the safety net. In budget crisis time, it tends to be towards restricting it. In times kind of like now, we see a bit more conversation about how to possibly expand the safety net by introducing new programs, expanding benefit amounts or eligibility. And these are, I think, important questions to debate. And do have the possibility of driving poverty down further in the state. And in fact, our research with using the California poverty measure has the potential to inform some of that, either in projecting how it might affect child poverty or in measuring the impacts after changes are implemented. But what we've also shown, and what there's a little bit less control of over using policy, is the economic context that families face. In particular, the high cost of living in the state really offsets for many families, especially in high-cost areas, the poverty mitigating role of the safety net. So access to good-paying work for families across the state, and particularly in high-cost areas, will continue to be an important consideration, assuring that there are good-paying jobs, as well as that families, parents have the ability, the training adequate to be successful in those jobs. I think these complexities that we've raised deserve more debate, and some of it can't really be answered by research. One of those examples is it equitable for programs to be not scaled according to cost of living, when that's really a major driver of poverty in our state? And that's a question, I think, that deserves a broader conversation. In addition, how programs can balance their poverty-reducing goals with other goals that they have, like nutrition and other outcomes, is something that needs to be considered and discussed fully. And I think I'll end by saying or suggesting that I think this new tool that we've developed sheds more light on the picture of need in the state and the role of policy. However, I think what deserves more attention and conversation is how we can build the information that we need to better track outcomes over a long time. What we're providing here is really a snapshot of how people and children are doing and how policy is affecting poverty. But a truly successful safety net policy would improve long-term outcomes for children and ensure that they're able to take advantage of opportunities. And we really need the information to be able to answer some of those questions about how to create that sort of successful policy. Thank you so much for your attention, and now we'll be happy to take your questions. There'll be staff coming around with microphones, so please just wait a second to ask your question until you have a microphone right in your face so we can catch you on camera.
Did your data take in consideration subgroups like children of color, single-parent households, especially women? And what's the major difference in terms of the median or the average there?
That's a great question. And we do take account of a wide variety of different children and circumstances. In this work, we haven't really broken down the data on that level. We were focused more on the age and regional variation. Did you want to add any more on that?
There's some additional information available on Stanford's Center on Poverty.
Sorry.
Yes, there's some more information available on Stanford's Center on Poverty and Equality website. I think, again, that looking at additional subgroups is something we'd like to do over time as we have more data available to do a better job, a more precise job of analyzing those differences.
Yeah, you showed about 600,000 children in deep poverty. Did you get the percentage of how many of them are in CalWorks?
Oh, that's a great question. Another one that we haven't calculated yet, have we?
And would you assume that most of them are in CalWorks?
Well, we know that a majority of children, the penetration of CalWorks, the share of children on CalWorks is down and is not, it's somewhere around 10 or 12% of children, I believe. We did not, for this report, calculate the share of children in deep poverty on CalWorks. So I would hesitate to say that it's most. It's something we could look at.
Yeah. Oh. Sorry, right here.
At some point, are you going to break down the lines where public assistance of the various types actually penetrates these different populations, so you can tell where the line is for CalWorks eligibility and food stamps and free lunch, etc.?
What we've done already, and I would point you towards, is that kind of breakdown in how the various programs impact overall poverty in California, to show their kind of relative ability to reduce poverty. What we're able to do with the data we have so far is to do that kind of on a statewide level, but we don't have enough data yet to be able to answer the same question for children. Now, the eligibility and other issues is something that we've taken into account in trying to model what we've done. So we could, for example, conduct simulations, like if more of the eligible population were participating in whatever program, how much more would, how different would our poverty rates look? And that's something we'd like to explore, and we haven't done in full detail yet.
Did your data take any look at college assistance, ability to access financial grants, Cal Grant, any data like that?
Unfortunately, we've, for the most part, had to exclude college students from kind of our universe, which is typical to poverty statistics, because the circumstances are just so different. So the simple answer is no. But it's definitely a special population that deserves more attention.
Just a quick question. How does California rate across the lines with other states?
So based on the Census Bureau Supplemental Poverty Measure, which is kind of the same spirit as our measure, but is conducted for all, the Census Bureau estimates it for all states, California has the highest poverty rate on that measure. And we actually posted on our website, on our PPIC blog, about that just a little bit yesterday. So I would refer you to that, but I would say that yes, according to the SPM, and probably if we did the same kind of California poverty measure for all the states, which is infeasible, but I think we can extrapolate that we would conclude that the poverty rate here on those measures is highest. But it's really the big driver there is housing costs and cost of living. It's not so much that that our population is resource poor. It's that I think we are families face higher thresholds of needs. And so if you were to compare resources across states, I think you come to a different conclusion. Yeah. So
I know your research didn't address this directly, but any further thoughts or speculation as to what kind of policy levers we have in California to address poverty?
Oh, there's a set of things that we would like to test and simulate. For example, the conversations about a state EITC is something that could possibly be incorporated. And as I mentioned, expansions in benefit levels or eligibility criterion. These are all things that, we already see the programs have a poverty mitigating effect to varying degree, but if they were expanded, how much more would it matter? And so I think that's something we would like to model. And part of it is, we seek input on what the relevant policy questions are, so that we can kind of conduct research that's informative to the current debate. So if you have any other suggestions, we would love to hear.
So this is sort of the opposite end of the college aid question. Did you consider including access to the state preschool program or federal Head Start, given that those are means tested?
Right.
And for young children?
Right. So that's definitely something near and dear to our hearts, and we would like to be able to model more explicitly the role of those programs and other maybe child care subsidies directly. So what we do is take account of any out-of-pocket expenses that families use on child care or preschool kind of programs, and it's an estimate, but it would be, I think, informative to be able to model that a bit more specifically, so that we could say what the poverty reducing effect of expanded program and Head Start or others would be. Okay.
Hi, I think you said your CPM measure was similar, like in child poverty, it was similar using the CPM to national data,
Yes.
Maybe a little higher. I was just wondering, given there's so much regional variation and things you take into account, do those two measures include a lot of the same children? Are they, like, what is the overlap? Are they capturing really different populations?
Between the official statistics and ours. It's
Different, like in some regions it's capturing, like the national measure would be capturing certain children, like maybe more in the northern region than yours would, or could
That's a great question. What we do is try to align our baseline kind of universe of people to estimate their resources and needs. So I would say, no, it's really intended to be the same exact population. In fact, we use the same baseline data, which is the American Community Survey. That's what our research is based off of, and that's one of the sources of data that official poverty statistics are calculated from. Are you?
included in that 25% of the children?
Oh, are you saying who the incidence of poverty and how that varies across the measures? Huh. I guess I've kind of assumed that ours was the same and more, but that's not necessarily true. Any thoughts, Caroline?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that specifically. I would guess that across regions, you'd get a slightly different answer, that if the official poverty statistics are counting sort of cash resources, but not the additional resources from the safety net, that in some places where the threshold looks pretty similar to the official poverty threshold, so northern and central Sierra counties, that you have you have more kids in poverty. So some of those kids in poverty, according to official statistics, would move out of poverty. But then it gets more complicated in the high cost of living counties, because they both have additional safety net resources, but they also have the high cost of living, so it's sort of offsetting. So then it's a more complicated question, and possibly interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting thought, like who's in poverty and under one versus the other, and how much are they overlapping?
So earlier in the talk, you brought up as one of the potential ways to address this issue was tying benefits to the cost of living in the place where you're resident. And I wanted to think a little bit more about that and ask kind of two questions. First, whether you think that the basket of goods used to calculate differences in cost of living is reflective of the spending patterns of low-income households and families. And second, what kind of evidence there is that people respond to these incentives. So you're kind of talking about neutralizing. I mean, theoretically, it should neutralize the decision on where you live because your benefits will be tied to the cost of living. But if that's not the case, I mean, so right now, money goes further if you live in these low-cost counties, and yet you don't see poor families moving there in order to make the dollars go further. So just your thoughts on those two things.
Yeah. I think you raised the key, some of the key issues, and that's why I think research can only go so far, because there's definitely questions of what's equitable and kind of some normative decisions. But one of the factors is the distribution of jobs and opportunities, and that's not necessarily the same in high cost and low cost areas, and that's partially why they're high cost and low cost, and that's not something that's under really an individual to control. And so we see, for example, families in higher cost areas that are in poverty have a higher commuting costs, face higher commuting costs. So that's evidence that one way that they're coping with the availability of jobs or other things that they value with the high cost of living is maybe to have longer commute and spend more on that. I'm sure you have some wisdom to add.
I think that it's the answer. It's complicated, and it really is a question of equity rather than a simple data question. So it's a question of considering the various factors at play and balancing one against another.
Well, the other issue is just
Oh.
So I think my understanding is that the standard unit of, for example, housing cost is like a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment, which if you're tying your index of the price of housing to that type of unit, I'm just curious, do you think that reflects accurately the change in the price of housing for low-income households and high-income households equally, or is there a problem with that as the unit of measuring?
I'm not sure I totally understand.
There are definitely assumptions embedded in the thresholds around what the resources needed in the standardization of the unit that the costs are calculated from, and then the variation by household size is then added on top of that, and the regional variation in housing costs is added on top of that, and layered on top of that is the ownership type of ownership. Do you own your house, or do you rent it, or do you own it free and clear? And so those assumptions, I think there'll be some sensitivity of the estimates to those assumptions made. I don't know the answer to your specific question of if we were to make a different baseline assumption about the size of the housing unit, how much would the whole picture change in California? I would hope not very much. I would suspect not very much, but.
Thank you. I think on but one of the charts, it seemed like the age group of children that had the majority of children in poverty was the 0 to 5. And I'm just curious if your statistics included those households where there was just a single parent, and then that single parent wasn't working because they had a child who was 0 to 5 age, and so they're not school age yet. I'm just curious how much, if you know, and maybe you didn't break it down that way, how much of that number and the fact that number was greater than the other two categories of children, how much of a part that played?
I think that could definitely play a role, and we don't have the detail to be able to answer that question yet in the single year of data that we're working with. I mean, the way that the model works is by accounting for childcare costs that are out of pocket. So if a family doesn't have childcare costs because they're staying at home with a child, then it's kind of a 0 instead of a negative. So they would be kind of less likely to be in poverty because of that, because they're not having the same childcare costs. But on the other hand, if they don't have the earnings, I'm not sure which way the offset would work for that kind of subset. But I think that's clearly a population group of great interest and target of many of the policies that we're including here.
I mean, in the end, we're taking as given families choices of working and choices in the broadest possible sense. If we're taking as given sort of the existing state of affairs, of the combination of working and resources that folks actually make use of in California, and then assessing that to understand the situation of poverty. When it gets complicated when you start thinking about scenarios of how you might change things, because then you need to then think about the ways in which families would actually change their patterns of earnings, where they live, and many other things. It's something we'd like to do, but part of the reason we haven't embarked on it quite yet is because those simulations raise a lot of tricky questions that we hope to get right. Take some time.
I noticed the report talks about children who live with families, and I was wondering if this captures, for example, unaccompanied homeless minors who are living apart from their families, and whether that the data for the older age group could actually be a lower number than what true poverty figures are for those unaccompanied minors.
So like the census survey on which this is based is a survey of housing units. So if you don't have a home, if you're in group quarters, you could be surveyed, although we do exclude folks in group quarters, and that's one reason why we don't examine college students, but there are other reasons you might be in a group quarter. But if you are not in a housing unit, if you're not housed, then you are excluded from the universe. And this is true of the census statistics as well.
Thank you. The first thing I think we all need to recognize is this is very valuable work that you're doing, and does have major impact for us. So I just want to thank you for the work, and hope that it will continue to be available as you do the next steps. So step one. Second thing, I guess one of the policy implications I want to ask about living wage, and whether that would simply just reduce the overall levels by increasing the income, and second, if you would think about this regional difference, about tying it to cost of living or not, but both aspects of what you think living wage might do for this.
I think that's maybe one way to get around some of the issues that we face with the variation in cost of living. There's a whole other host of, I guess, issues with increasing minimum wage and living wage that need to be taken into account kind of in terms of the macro economy and how it affects the availability of jobs and that sort of thing, which we don't have research here to shed light on, but I think is a factor worth taking account of. I mean, it will be interesting to see how, as the minimum wage increases in certain areas, how that, I mean, that's potentially something that we could look at a little bit more closely in the context of this metric, and try to shed a little bit more light on, based on things that have already been kind of coming down the pike, I guess.
I have two questions. One is access to Medi-Cal included in your calculation of safety net benefits? And the second is the grouping for Central Sierra, to me, seems strange. Grouping, and I know you said there were some reasons for data, but the grouping of the mountain counties with the large Central Valley counties and the employment, all kinds of things are different, and undocumented children and so forth.
I guess I'll take the second question first, since I absolutely agree. We're not able to separate out the Central Valley and the Sierra because of there's just not enough sampled individuals in the 1 year of data to be able to create separate poverty rates reliably. In the future, hopefully with more years of data, we could do more disaggregation. And then we were left with the choice of, how to group these regions. I mean, it could be the Sierras grouped with kind of Sacramento area, which would also seem odd, or grouped with Inland Empire or something. So it was just kind of some decisions that we had to make. And, we're open to suggestions of how that could be different. But I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. And hopefully in the future it'll get better. By the way, we do have a map on our website that isn't particular to child poverty. It's overall poverty rates using our measure that is at the county level. The reason we had to create these regions for child poverty is because there's fewer children But if you're interested in how our poverty rates vary by county and an overall population statistic is adequate, then I'd point you to our website for that. And now I've forgotten your first question, but maybe Caroline remembers.
Medi-Cal.
Medi-Cal.
Yeah, so the other big and important expense that we take into account besides work-related expenses is out-of-pocket medical expenses. So again, its model is sort of the absence of an expense. If you had fewer out-of-pocket medical expenses because you had access to Medi-Cal or some other form of health insurance, rather than explicitly.
So our safety net, like that I have been referring to, does not include Medi-Cal. So if it were kind of flipped, if we included it as a safety net benefit instead of a cost or absence of a cost, I would expect to see that the impact of the safety net would increase. But this is kind of we're following other researchers in other states and at the Census Bureau in the kind of methodology for how to set up a measure like this in general. But there's definitely tweaks we could do.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. My question is about safety net and then its impact is different in different regions. I'm not sure if we see a pattern where you have high cost and high poverty, high cost, and then also when you look at that, at the impact of the safety net programs in those regions. Do you think in some of these areas it can be access issue to the safety net programs? It can be a high affluent neighborhood or region, but it has pockets within that of poverty or child poverty, and the access is not the reach of the programs, that we're going to call it, is not that great. Do you see that connection there too?
So the first point about the connection between high cost areas and high poverty rates is well taken. There is, I think, that positive correlation in some areas and not in others. So in San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles, those are higher cost areas, higher poverty rates, but the Bay Area has among the lower poverty rates, and that's also a high cost area. So there's definitely a lot of other factors, as we all know, going on, including the distribution of income, the earnings of families, and also possibly the reach of the safety net. And I think you probably know better than I, but what we've looked at in the poverty, in our first report actually published on Stanford's website, we did correlate the kind of poverty reducing impact of CalFresh and correlate it with a measure of access to CalFresh from the program access index. And we do see that the kind of poverty reducing effect of that program is larger in areas with a higher estimate of access. Now we could quibble about if that's a good measure of access, but it's purely correlation at this point. We definitely see a positive correlation there, but it really deserves a lot more attention or a lot more detailed study to make any kind of causal statement about that.
And again, you're raising partly the question of regional disaggregation. We'd all like to do this at the, sort of the census block level or something, in order to be able to really get at the idea of neighborhoods, and because in some sense, that's partly where things happen, not fully, but it's unrealistic to think with this measure that we would get to that level. Getting down to the level of counties does seem feasible with another few years of data.
Hey there, Shahir Hyatt with the California Homeless Youth Project. We just recently released a report on student homelessness in California, and we broke the information down by county and by state legislative district. And so I'm interested in your map. I know it sounds like maybe as the years go on, you'll be able to get a little bit more geographically specific, because I'm really interested in how the information that we found matches or does not match with the information that you found, because there are some similarities. California has the highest rate of student homelessness in the country, and also the highest percentages of students experiencing homelessness are pre-K through 5th grade. So I'm just curious what other kind of overlap there is, and to speak a little bit to Kim's point about maybe missing some kids who might be experiencing homelessness, not even just unaccompanied youth, but we found that 270,000 kids experienced homelessness at some point throughout the 2012-13 school year. So it's not an insubstantial number. So just, I guess, kind of interested in, any thoughts on that, and wanted to comment.
Yeah, it'd be great to talk more later.
Yeah.
I really appreciate this research because one of the elements in the CalFresh program we've been pushing the feds on is they have higher cost standards for the states of Alaska and Hawaii. And every time I try to talk to them like, I think we're a high cost state, they say, well, they have cheaper areas they can live in. And I'm quite sure that's the case with every state, but I think this is something we really have to push on because that is one program that does give credit and looks at what are your housing costs, what are your utility costs. So I think this shows, regardless that there are cheaper areas, nobody is avoiding poverty here. So I think it helps bolster our argument that we should also be considered a high-cost state. Thank you.
That's great. Any other questions? All right, well, we'll be around if you have more detailed questions or want to talk further, and thanks so much again for coming.